Welcome. We hope everyone's having a great Thursday here. We're here coming to you from Washington, D.C. and California. I want to welcome you to our webinar on the impact on narrative on marketing in 2021. We have been so excited about this one. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that our two guests today from the Narrative Playbook actually helped us design our company narrative. And so I think as we kind of walk through the webinar, you're going to see kind of the outcome of what a good narrative can do for you, both from a small business standpoint, but also personal branding. So whether you're a business, and it could be small, mid-sized, large business, or whether it's for you as a person, your narrative is going to be important. And we're going to talk about why that is. So let's kind of get started here. We'll introduce ourselves. First, my name is Tim Ito. I'm the co-founder of Marketing Nice Guys, along with Bonnie Pandia. Bonnie, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, this is Bonnie.
This is actually, the picture is actually Bonnie's signature look. It's a striped polo.
It's my striped shirt. I'm not wearing that today.
Thing. We are a marketing agency. We provide basically all kinds of marketing operations services, including SEO, content. We do marketing automation, we do paid media, we do website, and we do social media, all the different things that you might see a marketing agency do. Our guests today, again, like we're really excited about this, come from the Narrative Playbook. They run a fantastic workshop that I can certainly recommend because we went through it. Our guests today, Toby Trevarthen and Rob Mcloughlin, they are the co-founders of this venture, and they help individuals and companies improve their narrative. I think one of the things that we love about this combination with the two of us is that they provide a lot of the design around your narrative and things like that, and sort of that early development stage. And we are sort of a firm that helps people implement that, if that makes sense. Toby and Rob, do you have any other sort of things that I missed there? Anything else you want to say? Hello to the audience and things like that?
Well, other than hello, I think you covered the ground that we would have covered. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rob, you good? Okay. Let's get
moving. We're good.
Let's get moving on the agenda. Okay. We don't want to waste anybody's time. We're going to dive right into a lot of the core things. We're going to talk about narrative versus story. We're going to look at identifying narrative resistance, how to overcome that resistance, developing your narrative, which is really what Rob and Toby kind of do, all these different pieces. We're going to talk a little bit about investing in your narrative, sort of this concept of narrative equity. And then we'll talk a lot about this idea of narrative consistency. So as you market, as you put yourself out there, how do you do it? And then Q&A, we're going to take questions during the entire thing. So if you have questions, just put them in the chat, and we'll kind of talk to our presenters here about answering whatever questions you have. And then we'll certainly take questions at the end as well. Okay. Why don't we dive right in? Narrative versus story. So what's the difference? And a lot of people, when they talk about kind of telling their story, it's often in the context of story, right? Perhaps some of you have heard this idea of story brand and how to put your story out there. You have to get better at storytelling. What we're going to talk about today is a little bit different. And to sort of explain the difference between narrative and story, I'm going to go to Toby first. Toby, you want to tackle this one? Because people, I think, are confused between the two, and sometimes they conflate the two, right?
Yeah, I was going to say the key word is conflating.
Yep.
And, there's a couple ways to look at this. Narrative is definitely kind of a higher order. It's more of a meta concept versus story. And one of the things we like to talk about in our workshop is, working on your narrative is the hard work. The story part's the easy thing, because everyone has stories. You can tell stories all day. You've got stories, anecdotes, things that happen to you over time. But how you construct those in some organized manner is really kind of where your narrative comes in. And we look at it from a point of resistance, which we'll talk about. But we also look at it from a sense of heritage, in terms of like where you came from and who are you to solve that resistance. And ultimately, we're always about validation. Prove it, show me. We're in the show me world. So showing me that you do it is actually one of the key differences as well. And one really good example, Nike, we went over a lot of examples in preparation for this webinar, and kind of keep going back to Nike. Everyone knows Nike as just do it, right? But if you look at it from a narrative context, basically they view everyone as an athlete. So for them, the narrative is about everyone's an athlete. How the stories manifest from that, arguably you could say Nike's probably one of the best storytelling brands ever, in terms of what they do, how they evoke emotion, how they pull you in. But at the end of the day, the overarching narrative behind Nike is everyone's an athlete. And a lot of work went into that, but then how it shows up as a story is usually, directional, one way, aimed at you, and how you will then interpret it. But what they've done really well is they've kept the whole dialogue open-ended, so they pull you into the narrative, and you've adopted the just do it. You echo it for them, you amplify it for them. And I would imagine all of us have a pair of Nikes in our
absolutely.
Yeah.
Rob, do you want to talk a little bit about that too? I mean, I think what I liked yesterday, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. It's like narrative's kind of that thing you hang your hat on, and everything has to kind of flow from it, right? And do you want to kind of add to that a little bit and kind of, I think, Toby, what you said about Nike is absolutely dead on, right? It's like, that's what they, the narrative is kind of, it represents who they are. The stories are what they tell to execute on that, right? Rob, do you want to kind of explain that?
Absolutely, Tim. So, from my perspective as someone who's worked in the insights world, the way that I go is to kind of make the complex simple. And narratives can feel complex. They can feel, kind of large in a sense. So the way that I simplify narrative versus story in my mind is that narratives have an arc and stories have an edge. Narratives are the long haul. They are the arc of your life, or a brand's life or a company's life. They are long-term planning, but with intention and purpose.
Right.
Stories are different. Stories have a little bit of an edge to them because you're always trying to get something out of a story. You're trying to convey information. You're trying to make somebody laugh. You're trying to kind of build an affinity with a group that you're talking to. And so stories have a shorter term purpose behind them, but they share that intention and purpose. And to your point, Tim, about sort of the umbrella approach, is that stories should, in theory, kind of ladder back up to the overarching narrative and share that intention and purpose. And when they do, it resonates because it stays true to sort of who you are over the long term of your life or your brand's life. But it also gives you an opportunity to take a little bit of a different edge. And that's why you'll see brands sometimes divert from their narrative and try to be a little bit funny. And it fails when it doesn't align back up to their narrative, but it succeeds when there is a little bit of that in their narrative to begin with, and you've built that equity, which we'll talk about. So I think narratives are arcs, stories are edges.
And Nike again plays that out, how they've backed kind of the edge of the athletes out there, with Colin Kaepernick and whatnot. I mean, they've gone to the edge, but they also have the permission to play there.
Right.
Exactly.
Because they've established the narrative at the beginning. And I think that's where, if you're a person, if you're an individual, if you're a small company, you really have to think about this first. This has to be kind of the core thing. And then so I think what we're gonna do next is we're gonna dive into sort of the elements of that, right? Rob, do you want to take this one first? And maybe so kind of tell us a little bit about narrative and tell us about a little foundation for it.
Yeah, so one of the key differentiators when we talk about the difference between narratives and story is obviously with the narrative, you're talking about that longer term perspective. It's the long view that you're taking. But there's also a different perspective to take, and that is that narratives are actually open dialogues, right? No one can tell a story for their entire life, right? Just think about it from that perspective. You can't talk that long. You have to build a dialogue. Now, within that dialogue that you're curating, you're building clarity, context, and confidence, both over the arc of you or your brand's life, but also based on what you're learning and how you're evolving. A narrative really has three core components to it. It's your beliefs, it's your truths, and those kind of infuse your stories with what makes you you. And we have an equation that we work with our clients on, whether it's a corporate client or an individual, that really talk about how do you get to harmony. And we really believe that a strong narrative allows this notion of harmony to flourish. And what it is when your beliefs, your truths are in alignment with your stories, which are subsequently in alignment with your overall narrative, you're being your most authentic self. And people pick up on that. And from a brand perspective, we've all seen brands that are struggling with disruption and are trying to go away from their narrative. And often without having put in the hard work, those types of diversions fail because they're belying their truths, they're belying their beliefs, and they're trying to tell different stories that, again, don't ladder back up to their narrative.
No, that is so true. And one thing I just want to add is when you're at Marketing Nice Guys, that's how we came up with our brand. It's based on what we believe is that we truly want to help our clients excel in digital marketing, and that's our overarching narrative if we want to take a look at it from a high level perspective. And that's how we are portraying ourselves as well from any of our online communications content that we put out there. It's with that particular focus in mind. So with that, Toby, you have anything to add, or we can move on to the next one?
Yeah, please go on to the next slide.
Okay, so we have a poll for the audience here. So I'll launch the poll, but Rob, do you want to talk through about this particular poll while the audience is answering it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we thought this would be a fun kind of interactive exercise for you guys. And this is how Toby and I kick off the workshop sessions when we're working with individuals or working with companies. This is a deceptively simple question, but it really speaks to an incredible wealth of information that we then unearth throughout the process. So basically the question is, do you want to stand out or do you want to fit in? And we ask this to every narrator, which we call people who go through our process at the beginning of the workshop. And it really sparks a fantastic debate once we kind of get into the nuance behind why an individual or a company kind of chose that particular question, and really also why they avoided the other answer. So go ahead. I'm sure the voting's open now. So go ahead and open.
I'm curious about this too.
Yeah.
So you guys will be surprised. Almost 100% of the answers are stand out.
Wonderful.
So nobody has chosen.
We have an entire audience of iconoclasts. Congratulations, guys.
Well, the irony to Rob's point is this generally dissolves into debates because this is really not an A or B question. It is a depends question. Mm-hmm. And I know, Tim, we had talked about earlier, and I know in my career of working with, thousands of brands over, my career, everyone always comes to you about, I want something that's never been done before, right, but I want a case study.
Yeah.
It's like, well, like you can't have both.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So so moving on. So why do people and companies resist owning their narrative? Rob, do you want to go at this one first?
Yeah, I think Toby and I will each add something here. But for me, I don't necessarily think that people at the core kind of resist owning their narrative. I think in many cases, at least in our experience, it stems from an overall lack of awareness. And I think it goes back to that first question that Tim brought up about the noise in the marketplace about story versus narrative, and the underlying kind of fundamentals of what both of those mean. So, for me, when we're working with individuals, when we're working with companies and people haven't put in this hard work to really kind of understand what their narrative is over the long arc of their life cycle. So there's a lack of understanding that we deal with first, because this stuff is hard and they haven't put in the work and they haven't worked with individuals like us. So they're working from more of an operational perspective, chasing revenue or going after their goals and that next promotion, and not necessarily applying kind of an overarching layer of strategy to it. So our first step is really kind of helping them gain an awareness of their resistance, and really kind of naming their resistance and naming what their narrative kind of goals are. And we do that through a series of processes that include kind of conversational workshop elements, where we're kind of diving into heritage and experience and core values, and kind of building a framework that allows them to, as Toby mentioned earlier, kind of make the stories the easiest part of the process. Because if you know who you are at your core, and you understand what your values are, and you know where you've come from, and you have a really good sense of where you want to go, telling those stories become incredibly simple. If you don't know any of those elements, or if you haven't put in the work to kind of understand that, then that's where you struggle. That's where resistance comes in. And that's where you might not own your narrative, because you just don't necessarily know what it is yet.
Hey, Toby, Rob makes a good point here. And I think one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with is what Rob said, is they don't embrace their narrative, right? So like they know their authentic selves, right? But then they kind of think, oh, hey, there's what the customer wants, or what, what my audience, if I'm personal, or my friends expect of me, right? So you're kind of torn. There's this tension between kind of what you sort of think you should deliver and who you should be versus your authentic self. And can you guys kind of talk a little bit about that piece of it as well?
Yeah, in fact, I'm working with a client right now. So part of what, Rob and I do, like I have a corporate side of my world, and then we work with individuals. And frankly, to me, it's kind of one and the same, because we're both trying to solve for a similar outcome.
Right.
But like this one company I'm working with right now, it's a very leading edge tech oriented company that's kind of changing the paradigm on the idea of time in real time. And one of the things we talk about is the continuum, right? There's a market driven continuum where you're reacting to the market, right? That's your customer. Like we're all taught to listen to our customers, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you listen to your customers, many times that leads to lots of customization and bespoke outcomes, and you kind of lose your opportunity for repeatability. A company driven initiative is something that is from me to you, but and it's funny because the difference between, say, a software firm and a service firm is software firms say no, service firms say yes, right? So there is kind of this very interesting tension between that. And that also goes back to the person, right? In terms of yes, no. And then there's like a purpose-driven part of the market, which is for this higher cause, this higher why. Why are we in business? Why do I pursue certain things? If you stay in that swim lane, then that's where people are going to gravitate to it. They recognize what you're about, and they either identify with and join in, or they don't. But it gives someone a reason to join in, as opposed to being told this is what I'm about and why you need my product. That's being pushed out at you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, for us, we obviously always tell the clients that we have that, you focus on what the customer needs are. It's always customer needs, customer needs, customer needs, customer needs, right? And everybody gets told that story. And we believe that. I think where the intersection is that, I think as a company, we feel like, at least our company, and I can only speak for our company, is that we feel like we have a purpose that does align with what people's needs are and what their challenges are and all those other things.
Yeah.
I think where, it gets hard, like if I think it's having confidence that your authentic self also sells, right? I mean, isn't that part of it?
Correct.
I think that's a huge part of it, Tim. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that we struggle with, both on a corporate and an individual side, is really the fear behind authenticity, yeah. Right? It takes a lot of bravery to be your true authentic self, yeah. Whether you're yourself as an individual, hanging out with your friends, or whether you're a company trying to kind of break a new path forward. And, the ironic part is that the fear is always there. And, being brave doesn't mean the absence of fear. It just means that you're willing to put in the work to kind of move through it. Yeah. And if you look at sort of entertainment, movies and music, or artists, or other kind of maybe non-corporate, non-marketing examples, you can find versions where people who were willing to be brave and kind of shed a little bit of light into their authentic self, whether through their artistic expression or what have you, created entirely new markets, right? Where masses of people followed because they all wanted to be a part of that tribe. They just didn't maybe know that tribe existed yet. And I think we see that from a brand and a corporate perspective, where we have these mavericks that go out and start something new, Apple in the 70s, Tesla now, tons of companies. And you realize that there is an audience that's just was waiting for that voice to be heard, in a sense.
Well, and I think that's
even, we'll talk about this later. It's a lot about harmony, right? Because,
well, and I think, it's even more pronounced now as we enter into the creator economy, right? Like everyone can be that person, right? Yeah. I mean, you look at TikTok. I mean, the whole design of TikTok is for performance.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, let's talk to the next slide, Bonnie. Maybe and this is a slide that I know that I've encountered at different companies in a different context, but maybe Toby, you can kind of talk to a little bit about this, sort of that what happens if you kind of ignore your narrative here and you're kind of get to that point where you could go one of two ways, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is like your classic S curve that you've seen in management books and whatnot, and we have found this to be so true, right? Because as Rob pointed out, we're now 30 executives later. I'm now 50 companies later. This slide represents a company or a person, and if you even just want to put this into current now times, this is the Tour de France, right? So every day you're doing 100 plus miles. And if you don't fuel and, put in nutrition, you're going to bonk, which is the red. So, I mean, it's just the clarity of this is, where are you on this curve, right? For most people, we've found that they're kind of in this now place. And they kind of recognize that, they want to go up and to the right. They want to keep growing. And in order to do that, given especially COVID and what it has done to all of us, some people, had headwinds with COVID and got paralyzed by it. Other people leaned into it and viewed it opportunistically and have now come out the other side with new skills, and they've learned new things. And I would submit that all of us go through what we call the messy middle, which is kind of point number 2, where you need to make a change. Maybe you've made a change. You haven't quite seen the outcome of that change yet. Could be a new job, could be, I need to leave the job I'm in. And you've seen all sorts of stats ranging as high as 95% of people want to leave the job they're in.
Oh, it's a big issue in marketing right now.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, and then you've got brands that are stubborn and have refused to change in face of the idea of remote and hybrid. Some were forced to go there. Some had always been there. It's going to be interesting to see how 2021 evolves, because I think this is, from here to the end of the year, is like how we're all going to land. And some of it will be crash landing. Some of it will be interesting to see how smooth it is. But coming out of that messy middle, you kind of have two paths. If you've waited too long, And I akin this to like freestyle swimming, right? Where, people dive hundreds of feet with just fins. If you come up too fast back to the surface in order to get the oxygen you need, you may get the bends because it's a heavy lift to get all the way back to the top. And if you've kind of gone over that edge, I think you've kind of moved from I want this to I need this. And that brings in a whole nother set of complications. So we're finding people on this curve, multiple places on this curve. And it's been very interesting from an individual perspective, to help people who are at number 3 to get back to the top, and to find some people in number 2 who are aware of their change, but they haven't quite maybe seen it. And then there's others who've clearly seen it, and they just want to repackage it, tighten down their story, tighten down their narrative, and get to that next curve.
One of the things that I think, Rob, maybe you can touch on this too, but Toby makes a good point here about like, part of this, I think what we want to re-emphasize about this slide in particular is that a lot of people who go to number 3, they're down in the red, they're not embracing sort of their true selves or their true narrative, right? And that's sort of the idea, is that, at some point around number 1 or number 2, you really have to start rethinking who you are and what your narrative really is out there, right? And can you touch on that, Rob? And sort of, I'm getting back to that sort of narrative idea, right? We've seen a lot of companies that go through phase 1 and 2, and they go right to 3. Right. And having worked at a couple, along with Toby.
I've got lots of number 3 in me.
I think there's a couple of different interesting factors at play here. To your point, Tim, it's about who are you serving? Who's your master, right? Are you ultimately in control and being proactive about your growth and your development and your evolution as a human or as a company? Or are you staying in the reactive? We all know that reactive over time is a recipe for failure. It's okay to be reactive for a short term if you need to be, based on market disruption, financial changes, all of those types of things. But you have to put in the work to get back onto that lifelong path of growth. Toby and I kind of joke that, in a sense, when we put this in front of a client or we put this in front of an individual, it acts as their Rorschach test, where they immediately see themselves somewhere on this path. And we've had individuals who see themselves up and to the right, and then once they start to do the work, realize, oh, I can actually grow a little higher, or I could do a little bit more, or I could communicate that better. We deal with a lot of people who are in 3, in the red, who feel broken and defeated and feel like life is starting to be too much. The resistance is too much. And we work with them to kind of show them that, no, that's actually not the case. This is a temporary setback. And when you look at your heritage, when you look at your experience, thinking about those experiences and that history in a new way can actually get you back onto path to growth. You just need help, right? Like getting a therapist or getting a coach and things like this. As Toby said, most people are in 2, right? They're experiencing life change. I mean, the great thing is if you're on the green path the entire way, you don't even recognize that this chart kind of exists, right? It's only when you start to face that resistance, from a sailor's perspective, when you face those headwinds, that's when you have to change your direction of attack.
Cool. This is great, Rob. We have a poll coming up pretty much on this question on asking users where they are on this particular curve. I'm going to launch that right now. But Rob, for companies, how do you, and Toby, you can chime in, and how do you let them know to identify where they are on this particular curve? Is it if it is a startup, then they're pretty much on the first, or if they are, if they've seen some growth, so they identify themselves as number 2, or how do you make them identify where they are on this curve? But I'm going to launch the poll as well.
I think the ironic part is most people know, or they have an inclination of kind of where they are.
It's a self-identification, and some are more honest, I should say, or forthcoming, where some might be blind to acknowledge the realities of where they might find themselves on this curve.
Yeah, when
Okay.
when we work with individuals, we find some interesting differentiations based on different consumer segments. So women versus men, younger individuals versus those that are slightly more experienced in their careers. We'll see people who come in with a really strong sense of what their narrative is. And then in our work, we do some experience with peers to kind of get the peer perspective, and it really changes the results a little bit. And then we work with individuals who really think that they are not successful, but when we do the digging and help them do the work, they actually realize how successful they've been.
Yeah, so here are the results of the poll. So majority of the people are in a state of change, and then some of the people have identified that they are aware of their resistance or they are trying to get back to growth. So which is great. Yeah.
And the takeaway is you're not alone. If you chose any of those, we're all on these paths, and we all identify with these numbers at different times in our lives. So
Yeah, and
it's
Bonnie,
about that awareness and about putting in the work.
And then to Bonnie, to answer your question, and I put this in a company context, I work from everything from the startup trying to raise its A round to corporations who are, Fortune 500. And on some level, everyone's on this curve. Big brand, small brand. The difference with disruptors or startups looking for the next raise is they may not be aware of their market fit. So they're still kind of in one. And I would say, when you don't have market fit with respect to repeatability of what you've created, be it a service or a product offering, you may find yourself in this wobbly place in number 2. And again, if you don't achieve market fit, you slip into 3. If you gain market fit, you become a rocket ship and start to look like, number 4.
Do you guys also want to explain the way you're doing new, and next, and kind of where that came from and how you kind of look at that from a philosophical perspective and things like that?
Sure, Rob, let me start with that, and then I'll flip it over to you. This kind of came out of my corporate world exercises. So I've been doing the corporate side of this for 6 years prior to us launching the Narrative Playbook. And Now New Next was basically constructed taking a company and thinking about how to talk about yourself in 3 dimensions. And this again plays out to the individual. So now is about hitting the numbers, right? Like it's all about hitting the numbers. We've got to move the ball forward. So everything is very current with a little bit of past. So you want to talk about where we are today, being very honest. New starts to talk more about the intentions of what we're going to do. This is our roadmap. We're going to be releasing this new update. And that moves up into the company in terms of people who should be talking about things that are 6 to 12 months out, almost what I call tenderizing what's coming. And then next really resides in the C-suite with the CEO who's talking about, I see a world in which, we're going to solve, peace. We're going to achieve, equitable pay, like things that may or may not be truly accessible, but it's a vision that I can see and I'm pointing my company that way. Or as an individual, I am pointing myself that way. We've seen that play out on the individual side and then on the company side, but the way to frame it is just, it's talking about things in 3 different dimensions. Very current, very intentionally next, and then my view.
I think what we find is that lot of people, and this just goes to like human nature perhaps, and company nature, is that they're so focused on the now.
Yes.
That they don't think
myopically
enough. They're just myopic on it, right? They just say, I'm just going to do the now because that's all that I just got to deal with it now. And they don't ever think about how they're going to project going forward. And I think that's a big mistake. And it's a recipe to go to number 3. Right?
Well, and we've been there, right? I mean,
it's a strategic failure.
Yeah. If you're a public company, Wall Street's pushing you there.
Yeah.
If you're a private company, you're somewhere in an investor's shelf life and they want to get their money back.
Yeah.
So you're being driven by the now with a little bit of the new.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, one company that comes to mind, and everybody's pretty much aware of it, is Tesla. Elon Musk had that vision of creating, utilizing, different energy for car, and he focused on the now with the electric cars, and now he's moving forward with expanding that to just moving the whole industry towards that alternative energy and moving away from gasoline and other energy. So I think there's
well, where I would add some context to that, I think Elon's vision for Tesla goes way beyond the car. I mean, he's trying to eliminate
for sure.
fossil fuel, right? It just happened to show up in a vehicle first. Because if you look at his history and you look at all the pieces that he's building, it is all about eliminating fossil fuel or dependency on fossil fuel.
Exactly.
Yet the world focused on Tesla because they could put it in a box and they could compare it to other car companies.
Well, and just to draw a super quick comparison to the individual, right? Just like companies have R&D kind of stored away for innovation, and they dedicate a percentage of their work to innovation, to moonshots, to things that might end up becoming the new reality. Individuals need to do the same thing. So we coach individuals to dedicate a portion of their work, their time, their effort, what have you, into these moonshots, into these next kind of entities where we can figure out the best way to kind of explore new paths.
All right, yeah, let's keep moving forward. We are 40 minutes into the webinar. So moving on to the next question, how do you overcome resistance and unlock future success? Who wants to go first? Toby, why don't you take on this one?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. This is where the hard work comes in, frankly, because I think at this point, we use the word resistance. If you're a product or an engineering driven firm, you tend to circle around the word problem. Like, what problem are you solving? Even VCs will always start to ask you, what problem are you solving? Or are you building a solution looking for a problem? Which is always a challenge as well. So I think it does kind of come back to identifying this resistance. And to me, the difference between a problem and resistance is, problem is very much an isolated thing I'm trying to solve. It probably was something I was pissed off that it didn't work for me. So I wanted to solve it for myself. And then it became, company. Resistance, on the other hand, from a narrative context, is about obstacles and hurdles. And how do you overcome an obstacle, or how do you overcome a hurdle? I think it all kind of comes back to the beginning of identifying what that actually is, so that you can proceed towards solving this question.
Hey,
I know that's not an answer, but
we got a question here, and Toby and Robin, maybe this is a good one for everybody here, but the questioner asked, most of the examples, while all good and interesting, are B2C companies. Who, in your opinion, does this well for B2B? What do you guys think?
It's funny, I work a lot in B2B. So one of the most powerful narrative shifts that I think we can point to is Salesforce when they came out with no software. Right.
I was going to say the same.
Yeah.
Because when Salesforce went there, it was ballsy, it was bold. It basically was blowing up everything that was on-prem or on-premise, with the notion that things could exist in a cloud context. That was a complete paradigm shift, and they had to stay the course.
Yep.
Because they were defying what was relevant and what was in the moment, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. I think the way that they project and keep discipline with their narrative in particular, and I don't care if you're talking about Dreamforce or anything else they do, it is so on brand, and it's so consistent, and they have become the CRM, right? I mean, and I think when you look at a B2B company like that, that's a great example of a company that just, and again, there's a lot of CRMs out there. Why is Salesforce sort of it for most, right? And I think it has to do with sort of their inherent narrative about like.
Well, and then another example is Intel. Like, we know them as, kind of a B2C company, but before Intel Inside, they weren't. They were just an ingredient inside a computer.
Right.
And they made, CPU a thing.
Yeah.
So that was a brilliant, historical effort to take something that would have just been an ingredient inside a box and given it a life.
Yep.
And then it took on its own reality.
Yeah. All right. So moving on, how can I begin to develop my narrative? Rob, why don't you handle this one?
Sure. So, I mean, we've been talking about this a little bit throughout the course of the webinar. It really is about kind of gaining that awareness first and foremost, and then doing the work, which is always the hard thing to say, right? Because it always requires work. But in our work at the Narrative Playbook, one of the ways that we help both individuals, teams, and companies kind of begin to develop their narratives is we've developed a insights-based assessment, and you can see a QR code there. We've developed a version of it for you guys who are joining this webinar. If you just scan the QR code, and we'll send you this deck afterwards, you can take the assessment. But the assessment we've developed allows you to quantify your identity, your influence, your ambition, and your voice. And we've narrowed it down to those 4 pieces intentionally, because those really are kind of the core building blocks of understanding kind of where your, what we would call your prevailing or current narrative stands. If you lack identity, if you lack influence, if you lack ambition, or if you lack voice, you may find yourself kind of trailing down into that red stage in 3 and not kind of capitalizing on your strengths or being able to make the impact or take the career steps or the corporate, kind of growth steps that you want to, or that you feel that you should. The idea is to really understand your playing field, right? First of all, once you have an awareness of the concept of narrative, are you working on your individual narrative? Are you the leader or a member of a team that also has a narrative? Or are you working on behalf of your company and really trying to grow the brand's narrative? So understanding your playing field, doing these types of assessments, they're all the first stages in gaining a deeper awareness and understanding of what the narrative can do for you. And then also understanding kind of from a quantitative perspective, where you currently stand. Because when we work with both companies and individuals, the results of those assessments give us a sense of both where they are on the overall stage that we showed earlier in terms of that S-curve, but also the areas that need a little bit of help or need a little bit of work. And it's in the analysis and the insights behind those assessments where we really kind of understand where we need to do the heavy lifting. And that's ultimately where we find the most value because they're usually there, it's just hidden or blocked. And that works for both companies and people.
I think one of the things to add to that is, we've all had personality tests. You get assessed for IQ, you get assessed for EQ. Everyone's looking for chemistry fit and like, okay, well, what the hell does that really mean? And then ultimately, I'm a red, you're a yellow. Like, okay, well, what do I do with that, right? So in this assessment that Rob has created, we've effectively come up with NQ, or the narrative quotient. So if you couple that with EQ and IQ, it's really about your voice and your sphere of influence. And we actually end up creating a playbook for you. It's your personal playbook. And it does have this continuum element to it, because all companies are made up of people and teams are made up of people. And if the person doesn't quite fully grasp who they are about and where they fit in, how do you get to this, fit, if you will?
Yeah. Do you want to like talk a little bit about that harmony aspect of it? That's a great point, Toby. Maybe Rob, you can kind of look at that, and we'll kind of go to the next slide, which is just
next
a little bit
slide.
about like that whole fit thing, right?
Yes.
And go ahead. I love this concept. I think it makes so much sense. I mean,
well, Toby and I meet a couple times a week to kind of talk about strategy. So we are doing the hard work every single week to make sure that we're sort of staying ahead of our own disruption. And in one of our Friday or next sessions where we were kind of zeroed in on the future, we started thinking about ways that we could kind of quantify what success means from a narrative perspective. And we don't mean jobs and titles and revenue goals and things like this. What we decided we ultimately meant was this notion of harmony, right? So when you're in your zone of genius, you are comfortable, you're confident, you have clarity, you understand the context, and you're just free to do your best work. And whether that's an individual, kind of the athlete is a classic mentality, whether you're in a team that's just firing on all cylinders, or as Toby said, if you're in a startup or a company that's just on that rocket ship, right, where everything seems to be going right, what that ultimately means is that you're at harmony with kind of your situation, your surroundings. It's your past experience kind of fueling your future growth. That doesn't exist unless you have alignment and fit. So we're working kind of backwards here with the equation, but alignment is agreement and alliance. Like, are my goals aligned with my team's goals? Yes. Are they aligned with my corporate purpose and my corporate intentions? Yes. Do I feel a fit, as an individual? Does my product have a fit in the marketplace? And when we solve for all of these through the work of narrative, we really find this sense of harmony. We recently worked with a group of individuals who work with a rather large market research firm. We kind of liken them to Peloton instructors because they're out there in the marketplace representing the company with their thought leadership positions, but they also have to stand apart as individuals. And what we worked with them on is understanding this notion of harmony. So how do you put yourself as an individual forward? How do you present your team as being experts in the space? And ultimately, how does that fuel the growth of the company? So by working on the individual narratives in each of these circles, we were able to get to that notion where they knew their swim lanes, where they could shine, where the team could shine, and where the company could shine. And that really led to a sense of harmony, as well as just an absolutely incredible spurring of ideas and new perspectives that allowed them to kind of go into the marketplace and actually do better work. Because again, they were in that zone of genius.
Yeah, and what I love about this is that I think this concept applies not just like, let's say you're in a company, but it can apply to your friends, your family. It can apply to your customers. It can apply to any number of things, because who you are authentically, right, has to work somewhere with your team, with your company, with your customers, right? Those are all things that I think, this is why I think this is probably the slide I think to me that kind of says, you got to really think about yourself first and your narrative. And that's why your narrative is so important, is that because you're not going to, you may be able to sell to a customer, right? It might be a one-time thing though, because you have to be so inauthentic to kind of do it. You're not going to be able to sustain it. So you're not going to be able to find that harmony. And I think that's where, your guys' course is like so good to go through, because it's about finding that harmony between everything that you're trying to do. And again, it's a hard thing. It's an elusive thing, but it's the ideal that you always want to kind of think about and go for. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the other, in the green zones there, I think the other key thing is lateral thinking or diverse thinking, right? So this is where diversity and lateral thinking start to show up, because everyone brings a little different context to the equation. And I think we have to respect that in order for us to be, achieve alignment and have a fit that is all encompassing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So how would you define what is narrative equity, and how do I invest in the narrative and develop equity? Toby, if you want to handle this one.
Yeah, and for the sake of time, I'll just I'll make brevity out of this. So we look at narrative equity in two simple constructs. You have case studies and you have use cases. And again, I'm living this right now with a client, and it's like, okay, show me, what have you done? What have you done to say that, to prove to me that you've solved for this resistance? Yeah. That would be case studies. Those are things that I have completed or, articulated, had a success story. I did it. Use cases, on the other hand, are an intention. Like, we could solve this industry's problems with our product, or I intend to, change the rules in our company so that, we have better flow, or, whatever the topic is. Right? So it's a way to look at proof of what I've done and intention of what I intend to do. And when you combine those are what we call narrative equity.
Okay. Yeah, and the only thing that I would add really quickly is to think of narrative equity in terms of a currency, right? Currency, you're either earning it or you're spending it. When you're earning it, you're growing. When you're spending it, you're sharing. So as both a company or an individual, think about the value that you bring, and think about the opportunities that you have to pursue growth and build equity, or spend it and share. And that could be within your community, within your clients, with other individuals, as a mentor. There's so many different ways to spend that equity and really share the wealth.
Cool. Yeah, and this is also where the alignment between narrative and marketing comes into place, because all the narrative equity that you're creating, whether it's your use cases or your case study, you can build that, and how you actually distribute it and get in front of the customers, and then you present it to your customers. You have them engage with your particular narrative, and then you move them through your marketing funnel from your initial touch points to your end of the sale close. So I think that's why both maintaining a consistency between your marketing and how you're preparing your narrative and putting it out in front of the customers is pretty important.
And if I could just add.
Go ahead, Rob.
I'm sorry, I was just going to add one super quick anecdote to that. I think equity also gives you permission to fail in the short term, right? Look at Twitter yesterday saying that they were going to no longer kind of feature fleets as a featured product. The equity that they built gave them permission to try that, and ultimately permission to kill it, right? That is a use. They were spending a little bit of their narrative equity, but they had earned enough to survive that. That wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was just a product that didn't work.
Okay, so we have a question from Eric Robertson. What might be a leading predictor to ensure self and team are equally represented to achieve harmony? It's a good question, right? And then what's the most authentic way to spend narrative equity today? Maybe you kind of answered that one.
Yeah,
Toby, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, and Eric, he always brings really good questions. It's funny. Again, I can kind of go back to the resistance in that question. It kind of comes down to ego, right? And leadership. Strong leaders allow their people to shine, where managers, can be a little more controlling and take credit for. And I think that's where transparency and open dialogue kind of, meets ego inside a company. And I think that's where, the element of leadership really shows up, because strong leadership allows that to happen and to be achieved.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Rob, do you want to take the second question? What's the most authentic way to spend narrative equity today, do you think?
Well, I think the ironic question is that what's authentic is going to depend on the individual, right? Yeah. So for example, I've reached a point in my career where I really want to have purpose-driven ways to give back, right? I've reached a certain growth kind of place in my career where now I'm actively looking for ways to give back and to contribute and to share my knowledge and to mentor. So I'm taking a portion of that equity that I've built and I am intentionally putting it back into the community to work with younger market researchers, new managers of teams, and obviously through our work in the Narrative Playbook, helping individuals who did not have either the privilege that I had or kind of the mentorship that I had early in my career. And I'm trying to actively kind of give that back. And that's a way for me to share my expertise, share my experience. I actually just wrote a piece for the new site Workforce, which was all about my kind of narrative journey. And it's a way of me kind of purposefully giving back and spending a little bit of my equity, but with the goal of helping the greater good.
Yeah, and I'd say I would just add one thing quickly, that I think what you said, the example of Twitter is a great one, right? It's they took a risk on something, but it was within their narrative, right?
Yes.
So they were forgiven for not doing it okay. And I think that's where people don't realize that they can take risks, is that
Right.
if it's within what your narrative is about and who you're about, that's okay, right?
Even the
Learn
product
from it,
tweet
and then you
was,
go on. You know?
yeah, even the product tweet that announced that they were killing it used humor, because they said, we're killing fleets today. Thank you, or you're welcome, which is really a play on, okay, we get that this didn't work, and that's okay. We're not going to stop innovating now.
All right, let's maybe tackle the last one, Bonnie. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of touched base on it a little bit in terms of how you take your narrative equity and you distribute it using marketing. What you want is at every touch point that you're having with the customer, you want to make sure that A, it's authentic, and B, it's kind of moving them down your marketing funnel, which is towards pushing them towards, not pushing them, but it's guiding them towards what the products and services that you're selling. And it could either be whether you could do it with automated ways, or you can do it both manual ways. If you're doing it automated ways, then you want to put in systems where you can understand what the interaction the customer is having with your particular products and services, and then you have your narrative kind of align with those particular actions. And there are marketing CRMs and marketing automation systems right now very much capable of doing that. So that is what I would like to say. Tim, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on the execution.
Yeah, I think, for us, I would say this, like for a lot of companies, when you work with Toby and Rob and they help you design your narrative, our job is to help you implement it. And I think our job is to help you implement it consistently. So you have to, I think, if you're going to be a company, it doesn't matter if you're a person, a company, you have to inhabit that narrative, if you will. So everything you do, it doesn't matter if it's social, if it's content, if it's your emails, if it's your website, if it's your design, everything has to fit that narrative that you're telling. So the stories you put out there, the way that you communicate with audiences, we always go back to like a lot of these companies that are like great at narrative and brand. But if you look at, a lot of people, everybody points to Apple, right? Apple's obviously like that company. The reason they're that company, though, a lot of people don't understand, is that they maintain such rigor and discipline in how they execute on their narrative, right? They only use one font, SF Pro, right? They only use a single color palette, right? That takes a lot of design, narrative. That's discipline. And I think for us, when we see a lot of companies, they jump from one thing to the other, where they are not maintaining that consistency is because they're not creating that discipline around always talking about who they are. And in that, so whether they produce content or whatever it is, right, it has to reflect that core narrative that they developed. And I think that's where we see the need for that core narrative up front, right, is because it it allows that person to say, oh, that's that brand, that's that individual, that you're my go-to individual, you're my go-to brand, right? And I think that's where we see a lot of companies fall down.
And Tim, that's frankly why the Narrative Playbook was born, because we just translated, or transferred, I should say, what we know should work in the corporate world to the person world, because a person just doesn't think this way, right? I mean, they do it for their work, but they don't translate it to themselves. So when you go through the Narrative Playbook, as you did, you're a marketer, like you kind of come out the other end going, oh my God, I wasn't thinking this way, you know? So that's kind of the cool thing for Rob and I is, you know, you work with a company, you get a certain sense of satisfaction, but when you work with an individual and you see them go through some transformative outcome, I mean, that is just so awesome. I mean, that's
absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, it's true for us. I mean, again, I think, you know, what's nice, and again, we'll take questions here. Maybe if anybody has like a last question.
Yeah, I guess we're actually running. We're running
a little.
We're at the top of the hour, so you know, I'd like to say
you got 4 talkers in the room.
I know. So thank you, Rob and Toby, for that awesome, amazing discussion.
Thank you, guys.
And you know, our information is on the screen. We will share the slides with everybody. You know, please check out the Narrative Playbook. And they also have this newsletter called Now New Next, which I would encourage everybody to sign up for, and you know, get tips from Rob and Toby here. Also, if you need any help with marketing, you know, please feel free to check out Marketing Nice Guys or get in touch with us. We also have a newsletter called 321 where we share marketing tips and marketing products and marketing ideas that you guys can sign up for. With that, anything else you guys want to say in the end?
Thank you, guys. Think about the arc. Think about your narrative. It makes a huge difference.
Okay. And what is your narrative equity that you may already have and you're not thinking about how to apply it?
Absolutely. All right.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good day. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.